the question of genre and cultural ordering, the sort of breakthrough moment came when I was reading through these record sleeves, Jesus and Mary Chain. And Jim Reed from the Jesus and Mary Chain said this. He was talking about them meeting a producer who was going to produce their next album at the time, which became the album Automatic. We met Daniel Lanois. He said we could come to New Orleans and wouldn't need to go to a studio, just hire a big church. He asked what kind of sound we had in mind. We kind of said drum machines, sequencers, and hip-hop music. The guy practically shat himself on the spot. We never heard from him again. Now, the reason that sort of encapsulated what I was trying to understand about music was because this was a version of cultural ordering, of genre, that was about discontent, that it was about discomfort, that it was about trying to distance yourself from the identification of music genres and labels. And it revealed something different, I think, to the stuff that I was reading in the sociology. It revealed something different about cultural ordering, the way it works. They weren't that happy with this producer and the way he was acting, so they used music genre as a way of pushing that producer away, of creating a sense of distance. So there's this kind of, what this revealed for me was a kind of nature of music genre, the nature of cultural ordering on the ground. And the way in which that's part of our discontent, eclecticism, there's a kind of chaos to it, an openness, a kind of dissidence is communicated in that quote from Jesus and Mary Chain, I think. And what it reveals is that music genre is not these kind of set categories that we can use for analysing the social world in particular ways and mapping that onto social class or any other kind of division. It doesn't really work like that on the ground, I don't think. But what it actually suggests is that when we think about cultural ordering and something like genre, we have to think about the way that people are drawing and redrawing the lines of genre and the way in which these different versions of genre mesh together, the complexity. But what we're looking at really is the vitality of music genre, the vitality of cultural ordering processes as they happen in people's everyday lives. That's really what I got at from that particular quote. And it may seem odd, but it allowed me to kind of, I often think cultural resources are a good thing to use when you're thinking through analytical problems from outside of your discipline. It allowed me to see that problem, to see the way in which people use music genre on the ground, the way that these lines are being drawn and redrawn. So what I wanted to think about was this movement, this kind of flexibility, this fluidity, this kind of flux of genre and cultural ordering processes as they occur. And I then started to think, well, can you use digital byproduct data or big data, whatever you want to call it, new forms of digital data? Can you use those in order to understand this flux, these processes of cultural ordering as they occur? That's what I wanted to get at, and that's what I'm going to do in the rest of the paper. So the starting point for me was trying to think this through conceptually. So I wanted to generate this notion of what I call the classification imagination, which I developed in a couple of places. Not a particularly complicated concept, but it brings together some of the visions of broader ordering and classification process and tries to apply those to culture. And the starting point for that was Bowker and Starr's book, Sorting Things Out. I don't know if that's a book that people are familiar with. And in that book, they tell the story of everyday ordering process, everyday classification processes and their consequences. They look at infrastructures, but they also look at the way that we order and classify the things that are around us, and that allows us to cope with the complexity of the world that we're faced with. The way that we organise medicine cabinets, our houses, our kitchens, whatever else it might be, and how that's a part of a kind of ongoing process in which our own classification processes rub up against the classification processes that we're provided with that are in the world around us. So what Bowker and Starr did is they looked at this kind of practical ontology, as they call it, of ordering process, of classification processes, and the way that these different systems work in everyday life, the way that our own systems of classification work with the ones that are provided in the infrastructures that we're surrounded by. They looked at that as a set of processes, and that's a really good book for understanding that. And alongside that then, I was also reading Michel Foucault's The Order of Things. And in one of the chapters in there, Foucault talks about the distinction between what he calls the grid and the eye, or the grid and the encoded eye in that book. And what he develops there is a way of understanding how those ad hoc classification systems rub up against those ones that provide the infrastructures we're surrounded by. So he talks about the grid, which exists there, and it's a grid of classifications. And what the encoded eye does is, when it sees things, it allocates them to a space in those grids. So we're all walking around with these grids, these classificatory grids, And then we encounter things and we use those grids. We fill the gaps with the things we encounter, and that's the process of the encoded eye. So Foucault describes it as this process of the grid and the encoded eye working together to try to classify these things that we're surrounded by. So what I tried to do with the concept of classificatory imagination was to think about the way that people engage with and imagine systems of classification. How do they use something like an existing music genre category? How do they put music into it? How do they create their own genres? How do they imagine new genres? How do they create new neologisms or cut and shut genres? Where do they emerge from? That's what the classificatory imagination is about. It's about the engagement with existing classifications and how we imagine new ones and create new opportunities for classifying and ordering culture. So what I wanted to get at with that particular concept was this balance between the encoded eye and the grid, or the balance between ad hoc, our own classification systems that we create for ourselves in order to manage the world around us. How do we manage this kind of tension between those ad hoc classification systems and the classification systems that are in the world around us already? So imagine that in the case of music genre, how do we manage those things? So it's about trying to understand this relationship between provided classifications and the ones we imagine, between the grid and the encoded eye and how those two things are enacted. So that was the kind of starting point, was the notion of the classificatory imagination. So then I took that and applied that to music cultures. And what that did instantly was throw up kind of three problems that I think social research, sociology, whatever discipline you might be from, faces when trying to understand music culture. If you insert the classification imagination or try to use that as a concept for thinking about something like music genre, it creates three distinct problems, I think. The first one is, how do we understand the drawing of lines within complex and messy cultural formations? So how do we understand the drawing of lines, the way that people draw and redraw lines, when you've got this mass of different classificatory systems operating and people interpreting them in different ways? How do you do that? That's the first problem. The second problem it creates for people interested in trying to understand culture ordering, the second problem it creates is, how do we understand the way that people draw the boundaries around new and emergent music genres or systems or classificatory labels, if you like? How do we understand the way these things emerge, and how do they get distinctive properties that mean they're not part of another genre or another movement or whatever else it might be? They've got their own distinctive label. And how is it that those boundaries on those new and emergent genres are policed by the people who have an investment in them? That's the second one. And then the final one, the final problem, was, how do we understand the drawing of boundaries around a priori existing genres, around the genres that we all are familiar with, that the sociologists are using quite frequently? How do we understand the way that people draw boundaries around those existing popular and well-known genres? Because they're not just fixed categories. They're not just fixed categories. The boundaries on those a priori, those fixed and established music genres, are in flux as well. They're being drawn and redrawn by people who have an investment in those genres. That's where you get at the vitality of cultural ordering. So it created, thinking of it in terms of the classification imagination, allowed me to open up the vitality of cultural ordering processes and to see the way in which these boundaries are being drawn and redrawn around this complex, massive cultural ordering that goes on around new and emergent genres and around established genres. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a couple of those problems now using digital byproduct data. That's what I hope to do, so that we can maybe get some understanding of what that type of data might reveal about those cultural processes that are happening, those cultural ordering processes that are happening, and to maybe reveal patterns or to see inside some of those processes. So what I'm going to start with an existing established genre that we're all probably familiar with, or that we'll all have heard of if we're not familiar with the music, which is hip-hop. So what I did for this project was I was working with a bit of software called a social media data aggregator, or social media listener. And what that bit of software does is you can put keywords in, and then you can follow and gather data, social media data, on that that contains that keyword. And this is drawn predominantly from Twitter, but that's because that's where most of the activity is. but it also includes Facebook, blogs, and also news, different sorts of discussion boards. But predominantly the data extracted comes from Twitter when you do that type of work. Now that piece of software is a commercial piece of software, and the project I was working on, well, the question I'd asked myself is, can you use commercial data analytics packages to do critical social science? That's the kind of question I was working with in the broader project, and I wrote a piece where I looked at the discipline of sociology as a kind of brand using this software package. But I also used hip hop. So the search term was hip hop, and it gathered data for a few months on hip hop. That anything that contained that combination of words was captured in the data set that I was working with at the time. So what I wanted to do then was to try to think, well, can you actually find something out about this genre from this data? And it is limited because the commercial software packages are not set up for doing critical social science. They're set up for trying to understand buzz around brands and things like that. So the people that I was working with, they also had other clients that were commercial companies that wanted to understand the social media response to their products, their brand, events, and the like. So it's not really set up for this, but I was trying to think imaginatively about how you could use the software to do social research. So here's an example, and we can perhaps judge whether or not there's any value in it. Now this particular software package did lots of different things. You could measure sentiment, so you could look at the positive and negative neutral sentiments that are associated with a keyword. So in another project I did, I looked at the positive, negative sentiments around those that were using the word sociology. In this instance, hip hop. You can look at buzz. You can look at who the influential voices are in that area. So who are the influential people that are talking about the keyword, in this case hip hop, who are the influential voices. And there's quite complex ways of measuring that, which are discussed in the paper if anybody wants to read about it. But the one I chose when I was doing music genres, because it was the one that seemed most helpful, was the most basic thing that the software package did, which was it created these word maps or word clouds of type that you could use to try to think about the way that that particular topic was being discussed. So what you've got here are the words that are most commonly associated with hip-hop in the social media content, right? And this is the word map it's generated. And where you've got lines between those words, that's when those words were used together in a sentence, or commonly used together in describing hip-hop music. Okay? So this is the word map you started with. So what I did was then I started to look at some of these individual words. Now if you click on one of these, if you take dead for example, if you click on, you've got dead and hip-hop combined. If you click on that, it then generates the actual social media content that that's based on. So what you can do is, and this is one of the kind of, I suppose, the benefits that are often attached in the big media rhetoric with these types of data, is that you can move between quantitative and qualitative forms of analysis quite easily. So you can move, so you can see the patterns and then drill into the patterns to see the actual utterances that people have made. So you could click on dead, you go into that, and it generates a list of content. In that case, it was a discussion of whether or not hip-hop is dead as a music genre. Is it a dead genre? Is it a zombie genre? Right? And instantly what you get then are people who say, no, it's not dead, it's just you think it is because you're not in the underground scene. You know, you're not seeing the real stuff as it's happening. So instantly you get the boundary drawing going on. So these are the kind of words I picked out that allow me to understand the way that people were drawing, policing the boundaries around hip-hop as a genre. So what we saw then is, hip-hop is not this fixed genre that you might find in social research surveys and then analysed in different ways to understand taste. It's a mobile thing whose boundaries are being drawn and redrawn by these processes of classificatory imagination. And these types of terms reveal that. So is it dead or not is an argument. Yes, it is dead. It died, with the classic stuff. No, it isn't dead. It's still alive. It's underground. This is where the vital stuff's going on. You've got these notions of what is classic. In other words, what's the canon in hip-hop? What are the classics? What are the best records? People arguing about that. And no, that's not hip-hop. This is. That's not a classic. This is. So you've got those boundary drawing processes there. You can imagine some of the others. What's true hip-hop? What's real hip-hop? So there you've got people distinguishing which pieces of music actually belong within the genre and which don't. So which fall in and outside of the boundaries that have been drawn around the genre. Similarly, then you've got the kind of taste judgments emerging. So within the genre, you get people saying, well, that's good and that's bad stuff. Or carving out their little subgenres within hip-hop that they can then use for understanding that genre. So what you actually get revealed, and you can drill into then specific utterances, are the way that people are drawing and redrawing boundaries and contesting what's going on within that genre. So these are the tensions, the practical ontology of this genre, to put it in Baruch and Starr's terms, revealed in the data in a very limited way, but in a way that allows you to see the genre perhaps in a way that isn't possible with some of our existing methodologies and processes. Now that was the first thing I did. The second thing I did with a colleague, Mark Taylor, is it started to then think, well, what about, and I think this is probably the better part of the project really, what about if you start to understand the actual classificatory processes that people use when they're listening to music? That's what we started to do then. And this is about Michel Lamont's work, really. Can you think of classification systems from the ground up? That's what this is. It's a way of thinking of classification systems from the ground up. So instead of imposing, there are 7 music genres, do you like this one, don't you like this one, etc. What you've got here is an emergence of the musical field, to put it in kind of Borgesian terms, I suppose. So what we did, we looked at a site, Last.fm. Data is available on Last.fm in different forms. And there's a Last.fm playground. Last.fm is like a music site. People go to listen to music. There's other similar sites, music streaming site, subscription-based. And what happens in that site is that people listen to music, but they also classify music. So they listen to it, but they also create metadata. So they give it tags. It's a process of tagging. Now the process of tagging is a process of classification. The process of tagging is the classificatory imagination in practice. You are thinking, what should I give this music? What tag should I give it? How should I classify it? So this is people classifying music for themselves. This is the people who are consuming the music, classifying the music also. That's what's going on here. So what you've got is a ground-up classificatory system and representations of it. So in the Last.fm playground, and we did some forms of analysis ourselves, but I don't think they're as good as the one that's already in the Last.fm playground. People are invited to play with the data that emerges from Last.fm, from people listening to music, but also from the metadata that emerges from Last.fm, the classificatory systems that are on the ground. And this is one of the things that somebody had produced using that data that was available, the byproduct data of people listening to music and people classifying music. And this was called the Islands of Music Visualization, based upon tags. So it shows you music genre. It's kind of a map of music genre. The ones that are close to each other are the ones that people listen to together. So this is a version of the musical field, really, I suppose. And actually, it's not live here, but if you hover over the sea, you get other genres. So the islands are the visible genres, they're the bigger ones. And the double thumbs up for you there on that 10 minutes ago. You can hover over these and it tells you about the genre. But if you hover between them, what you find are the kind of sub genres. The things that are the in-between. The things that not many people listen to. The esoteric, the small, the emergent genres as they come up, as people classify and start to understand and use that classification system as it emerges. So you get at instantly the vitality and complexity of music scenes on the ground and of the emergent processes of tagging and classification that are going on in these spaces, but also what they reveal about the nature of music cultures and the nature of cultural ordering more broadly. And it's revealed by this kind of diagram, which actually gives you a level of granularity about taste and about cultural ordering that you can't really get, I don't think, from the sociology in the same way. Maybe people will disagree with me about that. Okay, so they're the basic starting points, but there were then lots of other possibilities for using that metadata to try to understand what was going on in these cultural scenes and movements. The one there, the one there I was focused on is one about trying to understand genre and genre classificatory processes. But you can also look at artists. There's similar equivalent diagrams like this for genre, where you can understand age, gender, based upon music consumption based on age and gender. And you can start to visualize those because the people listening to music have got profiles and they can be used then to try to understand those. Now, that's one example, but if on something like the Last.fm playground, there's lots of examples of people analyzing their own data. They're playing with their own data. They're engaging in a kind of vernacular form of data analysis, of social analysis, cultural analysis themselves, and often generating quite interesting and exciting visualizations that reveal things to us that we may not get from the sociology. So I just wanted, that's really the main things I wanted to cover. So what I found was, based on that, what I found was that you could, in different ways, use digital byproduct data, use digital data of different types to reveal things about cultural ordering, around classification in culture, and something like music genre. It reveals that practical ontology of cultural ordering as it's happening on the ground. And there's different ways that you can approach that in the data. One is to gather the data, extract or scrape the data, and to then use that to look at the way that people talk about that genre, the way they interact around genres, and what that can tell us in terms of the way they're drawing boundaries and policing the boundaries around the genre, or deciding what's in and what's out and the like. So the mesh of lines that we get around existing genres. Or we can begin to see this vitality and complexity of genre as it's lived, cultural ordering process as it's lived, by using the process, the metadata, or the tags that people are actually using and labeling material with on the ground. So how culture is actually being labeled by people on the ground. You can start to use that then to understand the emergence and complexity of genre and cultural ordering processes. So there's two ways there, I think, that you can address those three problems I outlined. You begin to see these drawing and redrawing of lines and boundaries, and how those boundaries are maintained and contested in culture through digital data. Take an a priori genre and look at the way it's discussed, or look at the new and emergent genres that are coming up through the system and through these engagements that people have with cultural forms, and how they classify them themselves. And both of those are about trying to understand the classification imagination in culture, I think, and to try to understand then the way that plays out in classification systems and the way that they happen in people's everyday lives and as they engage with cultural forms. So I think there are opportunities there, but there are clearly going to be limitations about the nature of the data which you may want to discuss. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you very much. I think we're going to move on to next talk, and then if we can invite you back
questions.
Up,
yeah, no problem.
I'm terribly sorry to interrupt
No,
you.
you're
I
right, Sharon.
forgot to do that. It's working.
So thank you very much, Dave. The second presentation in this section on consumption and audiences is from, do you use the E, Stephanie E. Pitts?
No.
No, Stephanie Pitts and Katie Robinson from Sheffield, the Sheffield Performer and Audience Research Centre in the music department. And this work is to do with understanding audiences and their motivations, and how those motivations lead to things like loyalty to a particular set of performances, or perhaps a performance group or some such thing. So I'll just hand over directly to you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you, Darren, and thank you, Sharon, for the invitation and the cup of water. Very hard to go at the end of such an interesting day when it feels like everybody else in the room is doing something really fascinating, but we'll try not to ruin it. So we're talking today about a project we've been doing as part of the Arts and Humanities Research Council's Cultural Value Project. But I just wanted to start by giving you a little bit of context, because I know most of you are not in the music discipline, of the work that I've been doing in the past and how that's set in the broader context of what other people do in music. I actually started out being interested in musical participation and why amateurs engage with music throughout the lifespan, what the long-term impact of music education and music learning is for people in their everyday lives. And I set out doing various case studies of people making music, and as part of one of those I also looked at the audience. And I realised that they were fascinating, and that actually the views that people had of other people making music and the reasons that they engaged in that music as listeners and the kind of sense of very active participation that they had as listeners have become questions that I've kind of pursued in a range of contexts since then. So you can see from that list, which now starts to look rather historical and as though it's been going on a long time, I've worked in a number of contexts, mainly related to classical music and jazz listening. and looking at various stages at people's experience of festivals, so the kind of immersive experience of both classical music and jazz listening. I've looked at Music in the Round, which is a chamber music organisation in Sheffield, at various times in their history. So the project in 2003 was looking at their 25-year anniversary and the sense of audience loyalty and engagement with that festival. As part of that festival, the Resident String Quartet announced their retirement. So a few years later, I went back with a colleague, Chris Spencer, from Psychology in Sheffield, and we looked at how that audience loyalty was being translated to a new version of that festival, to new resident performers, and how for some people that kind of released their engagement with their festival. They felt less loyalty because it had changed, and for others it marked a whole new lease of life in terms of their listening. Then with Karen Burland, who is at the University of Leeds, we decided to see how the listening that we'd looked at previously in classical music context related to jazz listeners. So we went to the Edinburgh Jazz and Blues Festival, which was very nice, jolly, paid for by the British Academy. And there we looked at a range of different kinds of jazz listening, which obviously, having just been thinking about genres, is a kind of area of music that has many sort of subgenres and different kinds of loyalty. We looked at a range of different venues, and everybody who we talked to about that project said, oh, well, it would be different in a jazz club. So then we did that, and it wasn't that different actually. But we were looking all the time at the sort of social experience of being in a place, of going to a musical event and engaging with it as a social, musical, personal experience. From that, I've looked at new audiences for classical music, so trying to look beyond the kind of established demographic of kind of over 60s, fairly affluent, well-educated, white middle-class people, and to take new listeners into that context and see what they make of it. And there's a bit of that in the project that we're talking about today. I've looked at larger organisations, so Birmingham Symphony Orchestra was a project that kind of looked at performers and the audience perspectives and sort of compared those, except that not many of the performers would actually talk to us, so it didn't do that as well as we'd hoped. And Katie and I have both worked on projects related to music in the community, which is the outreach and education part of what Music in the Round do. So looking at that fostering of your audiences right from the beginning. And then bringing the story up to date, we've been working for the last 8 months, is it, on this project called Dropping In and Dropping Out, which is about people's sort of lapsed and partial engagement with the arts. So having done these studies of musical participation, of audience listening and so on, the question is always, well, if that's so great, then why isn't everybody doing it? So that was the question that we've mainly been asking. What's going on at the edges, at the periphery of that participation, and how do people become more engaged? And the other two current members of the Spark Research Centre are here too, Lucy and Sarah, who are both now working with CBSO and Music in the Round, looking at new questions of perceptions of classical music venues and so on. And they might want to say more about that themselves later, so I won't talk too much about it. So the themes going through that kind of trajectory then have been to do with audience loyalty and community, the idea of trusting an organisation, going to a particular event or a particular venue because you know you're going to have a certain kind of experience that you highly value, and then the kind of counter to that, how difficult it is for new people to enter that environment when everybody else kind of knows what's going on. How do you attract new people to that kind of audience? Being amongst like-minded people is a very important theme. So the jazz listeners and the classical listeners alike felt that they were doing something that was really special, really particular to them, and wanted to articulate the high value that they had in those activities. The kind of experience that people are seeking in that event, the sort of emotional, artistic engagement. And then, as I've said, the challenges of joining that community. So in many ways, I liked Mad's use of the word audiencing this morning. This is what I have been doing without realising it for 10 years. So looking at why people would engage with live arts and what they get from doing that. And I should probably say that within a music department, this is quite odd behaviour. Most musicology has tended to look at music as text, as object, either in its written or its performed form, but not so much at how people actually engage with that object and with those kind of cultural artifacts. Ethnomusicologists who study kind of engagement with music and cultures other than the Western developed world would say that they've been doing this kind of thing for ages, and they are now starting to do what they call ethnomusicology at home, which is looking at music as social practice within more familiar cultures. At Sheffield, we have quite a strong tradition of psychology of music, and so my work sort of broadly sits within that. It uses tools and ideas from social psychology and applies those to music. And another area where a great deal of work has been done on this is, of course, sociology of music, and maybe some of you from sociology will know Georgina Bourne's work, Theodonora's and so on, about the uses of music in everyday life. So this connects with that too. And within kind of music research, there is an awful lot also of market research, of looking at who goes to concerts and what level of satisfaction they have in that activity. And our work has tried to go beyond that kind of collection of data about who is there and more into the qualitative experience of why they are there. So these ideas I've been mentioning of attachment to particular venues, particular events, how marketing is received and understood. What is that sense of belonging and identity that you gain from going to a particular venue repeatedly, maybe even of becoming a friend of an organisation, feeling more invested in it in that way. I've looked in a few of these projects at repertoire choices, so the difference in the way that people use live and recorded music and the relationships between the two. And as I've said, the social and personal experience. And Jennifer Radbourne and her colleagues in Australia talk about this as a useful bridge between market research and more qualitative research. And they are talking about validating audience experience as a measure of quality in the performing arts. So that very often funding bodies are looking at bums on seats, you know, kind of box office takings, those very quantitative measures, but actually a real understanding of audience experience is something that should be taken into account when arguing for the cultural value of musical events. And if you don't know Radbourne's work on audiences, I'd really recommend it. Their edited book that came out last year is great. So to go on to our current project, then I shall hand over to Katie.
Okay, yeah, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the aims and the methods before we get into the real nitty-gritty of it. This first aim, exploring different attitudes towards the arts, this is really an overall aim of our cultural value project. And as Stephanie said, there are areas in the audience literature that need a little more coverage. And we wanted to investigate the attitudes of those people slightly around the edges, perhaps those who have never experienced a particular art form before, or who perhaps intend to but haven't quite got round to it, or indeed those who used to enjoy a particular kind of event but for whatever reason haven't been attending recently. So we wanted to look at how those people value culture and the arts, and if it differs from more active or regular attenders. The second one is to identify those engagement barriers. What does stop people from trying something new or going back to it? And through targeting these people, we're aiming to find out the possible factors that limit or inhibit their arts attendance, whether that's time, cost, or availability, or taste of friends, things like that. And we're hoping that with this we can collaborate with the arts organisations in Sheffield and help them to develop the way that they research their audiences. So again, that idea of not just who's coming and roughly how much do they earn, but why are they coming and why are they perhaps not coming back. And as we'll hopefully be able to outline briefly at the end, we want to think about some of the practical solutions to those as well. And finally, securing relationships with these arts organisations. This one seems to have emerged more and more throughout the project as it's gone along. In a moment, I'll talk a little bit about some of the initial difficulties that we had with getting in touch with these organisations. But over time, we're trying to build up some relationships by getting Sheffield as a whole involved in the discussion of cultural and artistic value. And we're hoping that some of the practical solutions that I just alluded to can serve as a good relationship building block with these organisations so that we can work together to build a picture of Sheffield as a city for the arts. Thank you. So yeah, I said I'd talk a little bit about recruitment and getting involved with the organisations here, some of the difficulties that we initially encountered when contacting the organisations in Sheffield to ask for their help or permission with getting our message to the audiences. most of them were extremely helpful from the word go, and these happened to be generally the smaller organisations that perhaps had just one or two people dealing with these kinds of requests. But the larger organisations were sometimes a little bit more difficult to navigate, and we often found ourselves being passed from person to person. Other people might have experienced something similar before we could find the right person who was able to help us, and usually then it was just fine and we could have done it anyway, so a little bit frustrating. But in these cases we were a little bit more creative with how we contacted our audiences and advertised our questionnaire. One thing that we did was hand out these. Obviously you can't really see it. It's a little flyer that we pretty much put everywhere in Sheffield that we could think of, with a link to our online questionnaire.
You could have had one each, we've got loads left.
Yeah. Well, we should have bought the whole box.
We should.
So yeah, and we went to a range of events in Sheffield, from talks about the arts to theatre and cinema, handing out these flyers and trying to get audiences engaged with the questionnaire and giving us their opinions. I also attended a coffee morning at the University of the Third Age members, who again were really willing to help and really interested in the project, and that got a lot of response, as did writing a small piece for the Sheffield community magazine Now Then, which some of you might have heard of, don't know, and inviting the readers of that to contribute to the discussion, again by giving us their opinions. So this questionnaire itself then, it was an online survey that probably took respondents between 10 and 15 minutes to complete, with a mixture of qualitative questions and some questions involving them being asked to rate their attendance at different kinds of events or different kinds of venues on a 5-point scale, from how likely they were to try it to how unlikely, how often they visited a certain venue, things like that. And the questions covered a wide range of topics about the respondents' attendance habits. Oh, I've already said that bit. Sorry. It also covers their expectations and opinions of Sheffield as a city for the arts, and the opportunity to provide their contact details should they wish to be invited to participate further in an interview or our audience exchange, which I will go on to tell you a bit more about now. So the interviews were a more in-depth, semi-structured interview, of which we had 10, and these really delved into the musical histories and influences in the family and at school on early arts attendance. So did they go on engaging school trips, for example, or have parents who were really into the arts, so on, that kind of thing. It covered specific highlights and memories, both from childhood and particularly striking or memorable events in Sheffield, and whether those types of memories have left lasting impressions on their attendance habits now. And it also explored the attitudes about the things they are perhaps less likely to want to attend, and whether anything could change that view. Again, it focused specifically on Sheffield. How did these people responding to our questionnaire and our interviews view Sheffield as a city for the arts, and what could be improved? Perhaps what would Sheffield lose if the arts weren't as thriving? These are still in the process of being transcribed and analysed, but we are looking forward to being able to share that information very soon, so do keep your eyes open if you're interested. So the audience exchange that we're going to talk more about today was our little side project, really, where we took first-time or unlikely audience members to something completely different. These, again, were self-nominated people from the questionnaire who we chose based on their answers about the kinds of events they usually go to, what they would never think of trying, and why. And after each event, we held an informal focus group with the participants and tried to gain an understanding of their first impressions of the event, their immediate responses, and how they felt as audience members in their new surroundings. Stephanie's going to give a quick overview of the questionnaire findings before we go into the audience exchange stuff in more detail.
Okay, so compared to some of the big data we've heard about, we've got rather little data, although not for lack of trying, as Katie has said. 140 people completed our questionnaire, and that was a combination of 111 people who'd been to the kind of events and read the articles that we'd written, and 29 students. We did a later survey that was specifically targeted at University of Sheffield students to see if they had different perspectives. And broad overview of not very surprising findings. People who go to events in Sheffield and then take the trouble to fill in questionnaires about them afterwards, value the high quality of the kind of events that they're going to, and tended, when we asked them if they wanted anything to be different, to mention really quite small annoyances and distractions, such as difficulties parking and rude front of house staff and that kind of thing. And we're going to be reporting that back to the leaders of those venues next week, so that'll be nice. Interestingly, particularly linked to kind of increases in ticket prices or kind of greater concerns over personal finances, quite a few people talked about searching for a kind of guarantee of enjoyment. Some of them actually used the word guarantee, which I thought was interesting. So they want to know that when they go out for the evening, it's going to be good and they're going to enjoy it. And they didn't really suggest quite how that could be achieved, but that was what they wanted to know. Not making a judgment afterwards about whether it's going to be value for money, but having that sort of certainty about what they were going to engage with. They also needed to feel welcome in a venue, so that was partly to do with the kind of front of house staff and the comfort of the venue. You know, was it easy to get a drink before a show? Was it easy to find your seat? Did somebody kind of smile at you as you went to your seat? So all that kind of social interaction around the event was important, but also feeling that you fit, feeling that you were in the right place, that you were, doing an activity with people like you. And then, because we were able to divide up these responses according to the art forms that people most often engaged with, we had a little information about the different priorities that different arts audiences had. So for theatre and music goers of all kinds, the sort of liveness was the important thing, the assumed commitment of the performers. There was a lot of sort of projecting about how much the performers were enjoying themselves, which research on, for example, professional orchestral musicians would slightly contradict. But anyway, this sense that there was a kind of, unique in-the-moment event going on that they were part of was important. Classical music listeners particularly, and theatre goers to a slightly lesser extent, were very interested in repertoire and programming, so they were being very selective, making specific choices about repertoire that they thought they would enjoy or that they'd heard before, or that added to their recorded music listening in some way. If accessibility and cost were less of a problem, so for example at the Independent Cinema in Sheffield, where there's some very kind of reasonably priced mid-morning showings for the over 60s and that kind of thing, people who were talking about those said that they had a greater willingness to experiment. They would sort of go to anything that was in that stream of programming, trusting that it would be okay, and if it wasn't, there would be cake. So manipulating those different levels of risk seemed to be quite important to people. And people using the museums, particularly, and the galleries, tended to talk about the sense of escape and retreat from everyday life, and they liked the ability to just drop in, not to need to plan to go to an exhibition, but just to kind of drop in and spend a few minutes there. And I'm sure this will be very familiar to those of you who work in that area. Some of them wanted a lot more information, and some wanted a lot less. So I'm sure the museums people will be delighted to hear that from us next week. So, moving on to the audience exchange then.
Yes. So, like I said, based on the questionnaire responses, we approached those people who had identified one of our 3 chosen genres that you see up here as something that they would either be unlikely to see or had never had the opportunity to try. And the respondents identified themselves as willing to be approached for this by completing the sentence, "I would go to more arts events if." And many of the chosen participants had pointed out that they would be more willing if they were accompanied by those of a bit more knowledgeable in that genre, for example, or those of a similar mind to them. And they were also presented with the option to bring a friend to make that less daunting if they wanted to, which most of them accepted. So the events themselves, we had Projections of Miles, which was by a jazz group called the J. Phelps Sextet, featuring their own arrangements of Miles Davis music that was personal and influential to them as an ensemble. We were joined by 2 couples after our third unexpectedly had to cancel for very good reasons. So it was a smaller group than intended, but nonetheless very interesting. And it was at the Crucible Studio Theatre, which, for any of you that don't know Sheffield, it's a smaller theatre next to the Crucible's main stage in Sheffield. The seating is unreserved and it was in the round, so slightly less formal than the traditional end-on seating arrangements. And the participants joined us for an informal discussion over a drink in the nearby bar after the performance to tell us what they thought. So Nabucco was the second one, which is one of Verdi's lesser-known operas, and it was performed by, please correct me if I get this wrong, the Chisinau National Opera of Moldova. Again, this was at Sheffield City Hall, which is a much larger, more traditional venue in terms of its seating and its staging. And we were joined by 2 father and daughter duos, 1 pair of friends, and 1 extra who opted to come by themselves. And again, there was an informal discussion in the nearby bar. And finally, we had In Memoriam, which was an Ensemble 360 concert and part of the Music in the Round May Festival. The programme included Poulenc, Mendelssohn and Tchaikovsky, and we were back in the Crucible studio again, like the first one. And this time we specifically contacted students to discuss the perspectives of those who were studying in Sheffield and students who had never been to a classical music performance of this kind. So we were joined by a pair of friends, 2 individual students who had opted to come alone, and a third person who, while he's not a student, is of that age and was really keen to come along. So we had the ticket for him as well. So yes, that is the overview.
Thank you. So one of the ways we've started to analyse these data is to look at what the audience exchange people have said in comparison to what regular listeners to that genre have said. So starting with the data that came out of our questionnaire survey, people who listened most often to jazz were amongst those who talked a lot about the engagement in live performance. So they wanted high quality and they wanted a real sense of performers, good musicians who engage with the audience. They also felt venue to be important, and they were fairly kind of disparaging about jazz venues in Sheffield. The Crucible Studio they felt wasn't the most atmospheric venue. This is some jazz at the Crucible, not in fact the jazz that we saw. But you can see perhaps how the audience are kind of seated around the performers. Performers are on their floor and the audience are on tiered seatings around them. But they felt that wasn't atmospheric. They really wanted to be in a smoky bar with a drink. And that's quite consistent with the research that Karen Burland and I did in Edinburgh at the Jazz and Blues Festival a few years ago. People really wanted a sense of social engagement in a jazz event. They therefore wanted to be with other people who liked the music. There was no space for people who kind of weren't really enjoying it. It was about a kind of shared, a communal, emotional and aesthetic experience. So our first timers then have these impressions.
So as you can see for the first quote, it's quite similar to what Stephanie just said. There were a lot of expectations around the venue, not particularly fulfilling those slightly romanticised expectations that they had. So, for example, a jazz gig they imagined to be in a smoky bar somewhere, which is exactly what we had from the regular listeners as well. And secondly, because of the space that we were in, which performs all its concerts in the round, for some of the respondents, the performers had their backs to the audience, so it made it a little bit difficult to engage, and therefore gave a sense that the gig was missing something. Secondly, there was this idea of the participants really seeming to appreciate the quality of the music, even if they didn't particularly enjoy it or know why they were appreciating it. So there was this sense that they knew it was good, but not why, and that it was perhaps something to do with the fact that having come all the way from America and seemed to be quite an impressive, renowned ensemble, the J. Phelps Sextet was very high quality musicians, but the music itself wasn't to the taste of the participants. And this can be reflected in another quote from Annie, it's not on the board, who's quoted saying, "I'm the one that kind of went no when they came on for an encore, but I did think that the musicians were amazing. I think what I find with jazz difficult for me is the improvisation." So the idea that whilst the music was very impressive, it wasn't quite for her, and that's fine. And alongside this was the idea of needing to learn to be a listener. So, for example, when to clap and working up through the jazz repertoire. And there was a bit of a discussion about whether the respondents felt comfortable clapping in the middle of a piece after a musician had had their solo. And especially for Julie and Mark, who are regular classical music attenders, so used to needing to know exactly when to clap in the right piece. This took a little bit of getting used to. And one of them's quoted saying, "We just bumped into somebody we knew who was a jazz person, and he was saying, 'Oh yeah, it's fine to clap, it doesn't matter.' So I felt more happy then." And then on top of this, there was the fact that the concert was by no means an introduction to jazz music. It was the musicians' own selections of Miles Davis songs, and so there wasn't a huge amount of recognisable music to latch on and engage with. And this was another talking point in the focus group, although it seems that respondents may have liked to be able to recognise a little more of the repertoire than they did. This wasn't too much of a barrier to their enjoyment. They still found themselves being able to relax into it. And alongside this, it's actually a running theme throughout our 3 focus groups. There was a sense of needing to know more about the event. The musicians in the J. Phelps Sextet did their fair bit of talking to the audience about the pieces and their motivations for choosing them, but there wasn't a programme as such, which would have been helpful to the respondents, we later learned. And this was common, like I said, to all 3 audience exchanges. It seems as though having some information at hand would offer a route to increased engagement. So that was our general impressions of the jazz.
Very good. Probably shouldn't say that we gave the 2 tickets that weren't being used by our participants to my parents who happened to be staying for the weekend. And my dad is still talking about that jazz that you may just go to. So opera goers then. From our broader questionnaire, we had actually fairly few respondents who enjoyed opera, and when they did, they tended to link it to other sort of large-scale events. So they were likely also to go to theatre, to go to musicals, and possibly even heavy metal. That's not consistent, I have to say, with other research on opera goers. So studies like Claudio Benzacri's ethnography of the opera fanatic talk about people who are devoted specifically to that genre and go very often, devote large sections of their life to being opera listeners. And Martin Barker as well, who's done research on the streaming of live opera into art house cinemas, again talks about the high level of critical engagement, the sense that these are knowledgeable people who go to engage with this genre. So we didn't particularly have that type of opera listener in our larger audience sample, but nonetheless we took some newcomers to it and found these things.
I'm going to speed through because I've just noticed we've got about 5 minutes left, so if you want to know more in more detail, then do ask us over tea. So yes, the first impressions of Nabucco then. Again, one of the first things that came up in the focus group here was the expectation of the venue and the audience. Unfortunately, our seats were placed right at one edge of the stage, meaning that not only were we right next to the percussion section and the orchestra, which proved a little bit difficult for 1 or 2 respondents in terms of their hearing of the rest of the performance, it was also quite difficult to keep your eye on the subtitles and what was going on, unquote. This improved halfway through as we were a little bit cheeky during the interval and we moved to some empty seats, which were closer to the centre and gave us a better perspective of the show. There was also an expectation that the audience members would be mainly elderly people who were, quote, really posh and a bit pretentious, unquote. And this expectation wasn't entirely fulfilled, as it seemed a lot less formal in terms of people's clothing and the overall atmosphere than what our respondents were expecting. Next came the comparisons with theatre and musicals. A lot of our respondents in this group were regular theatre goers. And there was talk of the costumes and staging being fairly impressive, but that there was a difficulty to engage with the characters and the storyline. And so quotes such as the one on the screen here, I thought the story might have grabbed me a bit more, thought I might have felt a bit more involved, were not alone, and the respondents found themselves expecting to care more and be more grabbed by the love story in particular. And again, alongside this, there was that sense of needing more background knowledge, and this time there was a programme available to purchase, which many of the respondents took advantage of. And they commented that if they hadn't read the plot beforehand, they wouldn't really know what was going on, even with the subtitles. And again, made their comparisons with theatre, though, saying that, quote, anything else I went to go and see, I wouldn't want to know any of the story beforehand. I'd just want to let it unravel itself as I'm watching it, unquote. Whereas they found this very different, needing to know what was going to go on before they saw it happen. So yes, please ask us in more detail if you want, just aware of the time.
That's okay. Should we skip over those classical music ones?
Oh,
what does that mean? Okay, let's do it really quickly then. Classical music is the area maybe where there has been most research, and so these findings are quite consistent with existing research. There are people who want more contemporary music, people who want less, but basically they want programming that matches their own preferences. Classical music is a highly valued activity to the extent that people find it quite hard to articulate you know, to fill in a survey saying, why do you go to this stuff? It's almost a silly question to them. But they do talk about the lack of audience diversity, and the people who are going, the wealthy white middle class people, are worried that the whole atmosphere is too rarefied and that more people should be there.
So yeah, as with the J. Phelps, there was this sense of enjoyment of seeing these instruments being played to a high standard, seeing somebody doing something that you don't know how to do yourself. And several of the respondents were commenting that they could see and feel the players communicating whilst they were playing. This was contrasted with one respondent admitting, quote, "I don't know how to play the violin, so they're just moving, but it has no meaning to me," unquote. So that debate of whether it's accessible or not to those who don't play classical music themselves. There was a lot about being able to see the audience around us. Again, we were back in that venue that we were in for J. Phelps, but more than the players, people that seemed to focus on the audience around them, noticing people drifting in and out, closing their eyes and feeling a little bit guilty if they lost concentration themselves. Whereas somebody else was talking about the right to be able to drift off, quoting, "I don't think drifting off is a bad thing. If I've paid money and I have a right to think whatever I like, I tend to daydream if something evokes me. I tend to think of something in the past or something about me rather than just concentrate on the performers." And again, there was this feeling of needing to know how to behave, when to clap, when not to clap. But again, do ask us more about that.
So our conclusions then are that listening is a process that people learn, and they learn it in that social context. They learn how to behave, and they have a sense of needing to be prepared, needing to be educated for that experience. In the classical example there, you also heard people sort of slightly rebelling against that, which is quite refreshing to hear. So this idea of the right to daydream means that the kind of points of reference, the expectations they have, are slightly being challenged against their own experience of listening in their everyday life, and they want to know kind of how to accommodate that within the live event. And I think this shows the need for some longitudinal research to find out what the impact of those first impressions are on future arts engagement. So these are some things that we are going to be doing next, but I'll just leave those there, and that might prompt some questions. Thank you very much.
There we go, some clapping and not so much coughing
Very
going
good.
on with that. Thank you very much, Katie and Stephanie. We need another chair.
Oh,
Would
yeah.
you like to come back out here? Great, I'm sure you'll agree that that was a really nice way to end the presentations. In thinking about the qualities that an audience brings, I particularly like. I've got a question, but I'll stand back and invite questions from you all to both sets of speakers in this panel. So, we'd like to start. Oh, right at the back.
A question for me?
Yeah.
Monograms and anagrams.
And engrams, meaning that you, when you in Word, you use the links which in various keywords. We do quite a bit of that kind of text mining. So just in your experience, did you try to work with engrams, that is using not as one word, but several words, and also several words that could be not generalized.
You could this software you could do, so you'd have a keyword and you could do variations on that, so that it
not just one word, right? But just not one word, but several words, and more complicated language.
No.
This gives.
I was limited. I mean, it was a small pot of funding, so I went with a basic package, which was also from a company that was local, so that I spoke to the developers through the processes because I wanted to understand the development of the software as well, so I had kind of like face-to-face meetings with the developers to try to understand the software and where it was going, because part of what the project I was doing was trying to imagine where those analytical packages will go in the future and what potential that would have for social research. Was really the project I was doing. And then as an offshoot, I tried using it for music genres, and that was one of the things that I did with it. There was a number of things I tried out, and 2 or 3 of them didn't work very well. But
So it's if ever you're interested, we have a philological people working on that kind of things of text mining, and it's free.
Yeah.
So and the software is free. So if you want to contact us on that, but no one worked on the music, so this is very interesting.
Well, the two where it seemed to where it worked best was the music genre. I tried about 5 or 6 things, and the music genre worked well in terms of it generated a good set of data, but also the one where I just had sociology as a keyword, and it generated a set of data of insights about the discipline.
Are people work with sociological, geographical, and these kinds of stuff?
Yeah, that was one of the things I forgot to mention actually. Yeah, it creates like geographical maps, but they can be a bit unreliable, but you can see geography. Yeah, thank you.
Matt, did you?
Yeah, it's more of a, I'm not sure it's a real question, but it's trying to link some of the thoughts. I really enjoyed both of your talks. And it relates to this issue of, you could say, competency, or the level of involvement of people. Because I was really captured by your focus on these sort of more peripheral, drifting on and off kind of people who are sort of engaged, but not really, reminding me of many of my museum visitors. I mean, they're just like hanging sometimes. But I would like to connect that to your the fundamental, the basic premise, of your data set, I guess, is that the people that actually make these things emerge are those that actually take the time to tag stuff. Is that right?
It is right. It is right. Yeah, it is right. But there are dimensions of it that are about the more passive engagement of people. So the data, the metadata, is reinforced by people listening to the music. So you've got people listening to music, and there you can see which tags are getting the attention in what combination, which can reveal things about the nature of the genre. But I suppose the other way you could, I mean, largely the metadata is constructed through active people, but it's reinforced by the listening practices of the more passive population within those music scenes. So you can see the level of activity around music genres as well, based on the level of activity around the tag. So you can see how, instantly you can see the level of popularity. So the map that I picked out, the islands one, the islands protrude because they're the genres that are being listened to most. So, and the ones that are in the sea are the ones that are getting less activity around them. So some tags are getting more activity than others based on what people are actually listening to. So that reinforces the tag. So the metadata infrastructure is created through active people, but then it's reinforced by the whole population of listeners.
Right.
That's how I would understand it.
And I'm not sure what my point was, but it's true.
It's right.
Level of activity and involvement. I mean, it's not that some people are better because they are more active, but obviously this is an interesting.
There's different levels of investment, isn't there, around in those media and in the music.
And experience and confidence as well. So the extent to which people have been to live events and feel that they are able to respond in what they assume is the right way. Presumably, the sort of tagging on Last.fm, because it's public, you must have a certain level of confidence to say, I know that's and that's what I'm going to call it.
Yeah, you might be. I mean, the thing is, a lot of it, it's people creating pseudonyms and stuff like that, the profiles. Not always, but some of them are. Some of them are on Last.fm. So, and I don't think there's any way of tracing who put the tag there. So, it would be in the data, but it wouldn't be visible for the other members of the community.
Are they doing it for their own purposes, as their own way of organising stuff, rather than?
Yeah. I mean, it's like it's interesting. Why would you tag a piece of music? So you're doing it because you want other people to find that music through that tag,
right?
Or you're doing it because you want to organise that content for other people. Largely, it might be for yourself as well because you want to go back in and locate stuff. But largely, it's being done as a kind of communal activity. what I can really, as the way I would understand it, you're tagging content for other people to find.
It really doesn't it, like going and organising someone else's book.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, you kind of, what you're doing is, there's your bookshelf. I'm going to create another set of metadata so people, although it sticks to your patterns, they can find that book using their own terms. So what one person might call, math metal, somebody else might call, give me one down. Psytrance, yeah, exactly. So you can find it through both of those things. So it's a collective act of cultural ordering that really couldn't, the infrastructure is only now there for that to happen. We've always collectively ordered culture, but the infrastructure facilitates it being visible and material. Great. Okay.
So yeah, this is just a supplementary question really, because I was fascinated by the map of the islands of interest. And I noticed different sizes of islands. I noticed hip hop came up twice. So good that you had to list it twice.
Yeah.
It's huge.
Yeah, that's right.
And quantitatively, I don't think hip hop sales are reflected in the size of that island. And I'm just wondering if what you're doing, which is incredibly interesting, the methodology is very interesting, is looking at fandom perhaps rather than anything else, because it's level of engagement. Classical music is tiny.
It was,
Whereas if you look at it on a global scale, the global classical music industry makes
massive.
more money than most of the other genres. But those people are less engaged. So it's perhaps a question about the difficulties of using social media and bias in sampling.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's not a representative sample at all, unless they're fair. And that really, trying to use it to understand the way that these ordering processes work, but not in a kind of representative way, because you can't do that you can't really do that on social media in a large part. It's just not. It's one of the big obstacles you would have. And it actually, as you say, it comes out in the islands because
you're aggregating data from large numbers of different social media. It uses Google search, presumably, as a tool, is it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it uses APIs and stuff from the different sites, but the Last FM one, for example, you can see that it's not representative through the islands, as you pointed out, because the size of the different islands is not what we would understand to be the size of the interest in those music scenes. Metal is the example, really, with that. Metal on there is massive with loads and loads of subgenres.
They use social media more than other groups.
Yeah, and that's where the fan base is, and it's it's demographic and things like that. But you couldn't use it. What I think the mistake would be to approach this as you would a traditional social research method and a traditional data set. That would be a mistake. But what you can do with it is use it to ask new questions or to see things differently. That's where the possibilities are. Yeah, exactly. So instantly, when I was playing around with this stuff and I saw that map of the islands, I thought this is a vision of cultural ordering that is totally different to the stuff I'm reading about in sociology. And therefore it allowed me to see the problem differently. And it reveals something I couldn't understand. And no individual could really understand. You cannot have a sense of that complexity of genre and know all those genres. For a start, I've written about the sociology problems being uncool in the past. But I'm out of touch, and I'm trying to find ways of getting back in touch. And so doing it revealed this whole new set of possibilities, really. So I think we see these things, they should interface, established and social media methods should interface with one another, and you should be using them to do different types of things. And I wouldn't approach them in the same way. I would see if they can ask different types of questions or reveal the world differently to us. And that's what I would do. Yeah.
Yes, part of my questions and comments about your project is more about this website, Last.fm.
Yeah.
I was wondering if this website, the role of this website in mediating processes of consumption. What do you think about the position of this website in this kind of metadata that is generated? What is the role?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing to say is the reason we used Last.fm was because we could get the data out of it. It's publicly available profiles, and the data sets are easily available, and in fact, you're being encouraged to play with them. I mean, I'd rather have done it on iTunes, but they have not got that option. So it's about being, there's no money, it's about being resourceful. So that site lent itself to free, not free, but, unfunded research. It's like trying to be resourceful. What can I use? I haven't got any money. So that's how I ended up using that particular site. It's not like it's a massive or significant site, but it is big, and it has got a lot of activity on it, and there are a lot of people listening to music. And we can extract a whole year's worth of listening practices. We're talking in the paper about that, and you can extract the whole, year's worth of listening practices for the whole population of that site, and use that for analysis of musical tastes and things. So that was why we use that site. But there are things about the infrastructure of that site that lead people towards particular listening practices. And one of those is the predictive algorithms on these sites. And so you are, the system finds music for you. So the music you're listening to is not an active choice all the time on the part of the participant. It's selected by the system. So when you're looking at the outcomes of like listening practice on there, what you're seeing is a combination of human and machine agency working together, which to me is interesting because I've written elsewhere about how algorithms are shaping music tastes, and they're not a product of the things music taste, not a product of the things we think it is anymore. It's actually defined by the infrastructures we're living in, but that's a separate issue. But that's one of the things that you would have to engage with if you were using those sites, because they do mediate listening practices.
And that was the point that I was trying to see about this process of mediation. What does that?
Yeah, they're not neutral systems.
That would be the grid part, right? Grid.
Yeah, the grid. The grid's flexible, but it imposes itself on the encoded IME spaces.
Question. That was really interesting. I'm wondering how much the venues that you were working with were actively trying to engage with audiences, and if so, how many was perhaps to an extent relying on your research to do the job.
That's interesting. We'll find some of that out next week. We're going to meet with an organisation called the Sheffield Culture Consortium, which is all the kind of marketing and directing people of the various organisations in Sheffield. And so we're going to present the research that we've done so far and ask them if there is a project that they would like to do next, because we could apply for HRC follow-on funding to do that. I know that some of the organisations are working quite hard with attracting younger audiences particularly. So Music in the Rand, for example, has a kind of under 35s ticket scheme, tickets for £5 or first time bookers scheme. So some of them really are working on that. Others, we haven't found that out so much, have we? I think the showroom cinema, that's not particularly a problem for them, is it?
No, yeah.
They've got quite diverse audiences anyway.
The thing is, we could have done thousands and thousands of audience exchanges if we wanted to, because there were so many nice combinations. And we did speak to them right at the beginning of the project, didn't we? And they really would have. It's a shame we didn't manage to get around to it.
Yes, this project finishes at the end of May, which is Saturday, so kind of run out of time really.
Trying to try more snooker, less jazz.
That
might work.
Preference going on there. I have a question about incompetence. So I got from
I'm just demonstrating.
And Stephanie's the idea of people clapping in the wrong place just kind of resonated with me, and it's fascinating. There's something about becoming an audience through these roots of incompetence and kind of wrestling with, if you like, not doing it properly. So I wanted to take that as a comment and ask you whether incompetence could be a theme that generates, or indeed if you would watch for incompetence, were they incompetent at all? Did they feel uncomfortable in the scenario? But then I was thinking about incompetence and tagging. It struck me that, and maybe it's the grid, as Matt said, that those tags, there didn't seem to be, I wrote down actually psy trance, as one that I didn't recognise that might be novel. So in that part of your talk, Dave, was about the emergence of new genres. Could you kind of see, if you like, incompetent tags? You can imagine people tagging incorrectly. There was unknown tags or something I saw on the map. But you know, if they tag it with a non-music genre or something like that. So incompetence might not be a very competent question, but do you think that that's an interesting aspect of
I do think
new
that's
audience?
interesting. And one thing that's particularly problematic with live performance is that you don't know what other people are doing in their heads. And you might make big assumptions that everybody else is listening in this very intellectual and critical kind of way. Certainly that's what I found with new audiences for classical music before. And there's this big anxiety about what everyone else is doing. And one of the nice things about the In the Round venue at the Crucible Studio is that you can see what other people are doing, particularly when they're falling asleep. And some of our focus group actually said, you know, well, I was drifting off a bit, but there was a woman over there who was, you know, gone for 10 minutes.
It's that the audience watching each other.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, that sense of sort of incompetence or inadequacy, I think, is an important one.
Yeah, I mean, that would be one of the ways of looking at the emerging genre, because it's not like a clean, tidy thing.
That's what I was
it'd be chaos, you know, people trying to come up with terms, trying to come up with neologisms, or you know, cut short genres, you know, things together. So you would kind of see that, because you would be able, you can watch, you know, Tag Die or Not Work and things like that. You can do that. That would be possible in there. So you could. I mean, it's, you know, it's not so much in that case incompetence. It's probably, you know, people trying to find a language. You know, people trying to find terminology, maybe in that instance. And then you get people deliberately mistaking things. You know, Justin Bieber, I think, gets.
Would they submerge? Would they submerge in the diagram? I mean, would they be not?
Yeah, they would just because they wouldn't be repeatedly used, so not much music would be tagged with it. Therefore, it wouldn't get many plays, and it would submerge in the sea. Yeah. So you could you could follow tags and see, you know, whether they take off, or see, you know, if you play with the data right, you could watch the metadata right, you could watch tags, you know, arrive and disappear and everything. But yeah, people deliberately mistag things. You know, for fun.
Sure.
You know, so they will target somebody. It's like an act of violence or something against performance. You know, it's like a little outlet for people to be resistant to.
But it did occur to me that diagram had a lot of established genres.
Yeah, it's because
they're the ones the nature of the visualization.
No, it's just they're the ones that are most visible. So when you play with the active version of that map, there's loads and loads of things you never heard of. So you hover over the metal thing, you've got, like, you know, all these subgenres and things. You're a metal fan. You've never heard of. Like math metal was one that came in my head because I hadn't heard that to myself. So you know.
I was wondering if incompetence is actually. Sorry, just directly related to this. I wonder if incompetence is actually a really important factor in this, because as someone who uses Last.fm, I never tag anything unless the only tag that's gone are completely wrong.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if it needs
there's a creative process
to say no, that's not right.
But I would see that. You see, they're looking at that as a population. I'd be seeing that as, like, you know, the way that genres are contested.
Yeah.
You know, the way that you see that as miscategorization, which it is, I'm sure. You know, you're certainly right about that. But there, you know, other people will see it as a correct categorization potentially. So to me, that reveals something about the fact that these aren't really very defined. You know, that there are these sort of vibrating edges to these genres, or there's a mesh of kind of lines being drawn around them. You know, it's like a matrix around it. You know, and for some people that bit of music's in the genre, for others it isn't. I can remember when I was reading the Class and Social Exclusion Project, Laurie, is it called something like that? Cultural Capital and Social Exclusion. Yeah, and they had picked a set of genres and a set of pieces of music, and really, nearly all the pieces of music you would put into the pop category, I would have, but they weren't. They were allocated to the different genres. So, you know, it's the same thing. It's like that. No one owns them, so they're being redrawn by what's been put in and what isn't. So yes, you would see that as incompetence, and understandably so. If you're looking at a population, I would see it as like the tensions and contestations around the boundaries being drawn around cultural order, cultural classifications. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a question that that probably overlap on your two works, but if genres actually, I tend to agree with you, but if genres are so fluid, is there any sort of aesthetic communality within a genre? Or can we just get rid of aesthetic criteria and even social criteria because it's so fluid that it changes all the time? So, and that actually tap into your work, and I was just wondered whether you find some, aesthetic criteria that come all the time in people's mind when they have to assess, I don't know, opera or classical music. Do you have like some kind of recurrent aesthetic criteria or justification that have come out in your interviews or focus groups?
Yeah, the opera was a particularly interesting example because the sense of having taken them to the wrong opera came out quite strongly in the discussion. Kind of this is a particular type of opera, and actually if you'd gone to one that was, earlier in the repertoire or whatever, so people were, even within those genres, this was kind of not very accessible jazz, or they said that less about classical music. It was just sort of, they separated it string quartet, didn't they? So that was more by ensemble than by repertoire. So our focus group people were sort of struggling to make sense of that, but they seemed to be focused on a specific event. So to them, it wasn't a genre kind of, the genre context almost wasn't important because they didn't know it. So it was just kind of, this event is representative of, what these kind of people do. So I think they probably weren't engaged particularly in those debates. But it will be interesting as we look at the interviews and the questionnaires to see the ways in which people describe the particular genres that they're interested in and whether there is any comment.
But I don't think genres are always that fluid. It's just that the boundaries around them can be contested and can be argued over and can be redrawn, and they're kind of vital things. But there's new and emergent ones and things, but there's established music genres that people see as having kind of, that you would get consensus around the kind of aesthetic properties associated with it. It's just that not everyone would agree, and around the edges of that is where you probably get the contestation. So in the hip hop stuff, there's like, this is a classic, and there'll often be agreement about that. There's like a canon there that they'll agree with or something like that. So there are, that's partly why I included the Foucault thing, because it is kind of that there are rigid sides, there are rigid properties to that grid. It doesn't mean I can go out and change what hip hop is by arguing with somebody about what's happening at the edges, but it does mean that there's contestation around the genre, or that people don't create their own subgenres, or they're different genres, or they break up that genre, they divide it up. Large genres like classical, we've heard of it, it's divided into different genres, and people create their own or whatever. That's the point, really. It's about those established things rubbing up against the ad hoc, how those things are contested. It doesn't mean it's all fluid and postmodern.
That sense of sedimentation about the stars.
Yeah.
The building up. So I have a question in the middle here. Yes?
Yes, I wanted to ask Stephanie and Katie whether any of your audience exchange participants reported any particularly positive experiences, whether any of them took particularly to the event that you brought them to, and if so, whether it was possible to identify any factors that contributed to the success in that case.
I think the overwhelming sort of message was that they would go to something else, or they would kind of go again to a live event, but probably not the thing that we just take them to. So it sort of gave them an awareness. Would you agree of the enjoyment of being in an audience, but they perhaps sort of preferred something else to be going?
Yeah, I'm struck by one of the classical one, which we kind of rushed through, otherwise I would have mentioned it actually, where she said that she was mainly film, I think, wasn't she? And you know how to go. And yeah, she sort of said that she would definitely go to something else, not necessarily classical music, but that sense of seeing something live rather than being sat in front of a screen was really exciting for her. So
And they were doing a lot of comparing their experiences to other things that they usually go to. So the ones who kind of hadn't much liked opera did like musicals. So they were sort of, it was reinforcing other preferences maybe rather than building new ones. None of them really said, I absolutely hated that and I would never go again.
Nobody said
But
that.
they might have said that once they left the room. Had that slight
They
sense
say
that
that to
they...
the people who were paying.
Well, quite. We had that slight sense that the really interesting conversations were going to happen as they left.
Yeah.
So we needed cameras and glasses and that.
Great. Well, that's timed really well. Can we just thank again Dave, Katie, and Stephanie, please? Because we're going to have a coffee now. We're going to have a coffee now, and then I don't know if is everybody going to come back up at the front to sit and discuss? It'd be quite nice to have people facing that way as well as that thing.
Well, I thought we might do real space.
Circular. Okay. We can watch each other that way. The audience to each other.
Can I make a bit of a promotion?
You do.
Yes, go for it. Do you want to do it?
Yeah, well, it's just because it is linked to what we talked about. Now there is an event we are organizing, ECHE and the Department of Sociology of Europe. There is an upcoming event on the 15th of July on taste. And the event is called Taste in Practice, and there will be lots of good speakers. And the reason why I'm thinking of that now is because you mentioned Tia, Dinora, and etc. But we're not going to get Tia, Dinora, but we're going to get Antoine Agnon, who tends to be quite similar in the way they think about taste in music. So we're going to have people like Antoine Agnon, like Mike Savage. So we'll try to make them talk together. We'll have other people. So you are very much welcome to attend. It's free and it's here. In the
When
same,
is it?
It's on the 15th of July. That's it. That's the promotion.
Thank you all very much. I would have asked you, but are there other kinds of metadata that you could use? I suppose I was thinking that you could ask kind of questions on cultural group, like so I suppose I think it's they must know, who buys, well, maybe people don't know the music there, but they know so much. I mean, I guess it's all too commercially kept by them to get
Most social media platforms.
Fascinating area.
them together.
I don't know how it works, but it's
I'm sharing. Yeah, it's like Mark did one of the papers we've got like technical content, like the APIs and stuff. And they like the big data sets.
So again, how did these, so the words on your first GitHub map there, how did they emerge?
They were just the most frequently used words in combination with hip-hop. Right. That's sort of that on that, and the software just finds that for you. So it's quite simple. It's quite powerful, but quite simple.
Underpinning is in your discourse analysis.
Yeah. That's exactly it. You could literally do it for any technique. Yeah. And a couple of months later, you have a part of it, whatever that term is, and you can analyse it in that way. You can do what are the keywords and then discourse. Yeah. You can see the patterns, discourse patterns, and so yeah, that was why I found that quite.